In World War II, history often sounds simple. America arrived, turned the tide, and won the war. That story feels clean, heroic, and powerful, but it leaves out something uncomfortable. Long before the United States entered the fight, Britain was already standing alone, bleeding, and winning battles that made eventual Allied victory possible. Yet over time, many of those victories became footnotes, while American involvement took center stage. In 1940, Britain faced Nazi Germany almost entirely by itself. France had fallen. Much of Europe was under Hitler's control. The British Army had just escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, leaving behind tanks, guns, and supplies. From the outside, Britain looked finished. Inside Britain, something else was happening. The country refused to surrender. The Battle of Britain was the first major defeat Hitler ever suffered. For months, the Royal Air Force fought the German Luftwaffe in the skies over England. Outnumbered and under constant attack, British pilots defended their airspace with skill, discipline, and innovation. Radar stations, ground controllers, and fast decision-making allowed Britain to stop a German invasion before it could begin. Without this victory, there would have been no safe base for future American troops in Europe. Then came the Atlantic War. German U-boats tried to starve Britain into submission by sinking supply ships. British naval forces, joined later by Canadian escorts, fought a brutal, unseen battle across thousands of miles of ocean. New tactics, improved sonar, and convoy systems slowly turned the tide. By the time America fully entered the war, Britain had already learned how to survive the submarine threat. In North Africa, British forces fought the Axis years before large American ground armies arrived. Battles like El Alamein broke German momentum and pushed Hitler's forces westward. These victories secured vital supply routes and weakened Axis control of the Mediterranean. When American troops later landed in North Africa, they entered a theater Britain had already fought to stabilize. This is not a story about taking credit away from America. The United States played a massive and decisive role in winning World War II, but it is a reminder that history often favors the loudest voice, not the earliest sacrifice. Britain fought when defeat seemed inevitable. Britain won battles that bought time, space, and hope. Those early victories shaped everything that followed. Yet over decades of movies, textbooks, and speeches, the focus shifted. The camera moved west. The groundwork Britain laid faded into the background. To understand World War II honestly, we must look at who held the line before help arrived, and what it cost them to do it. By the time America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Britain had already spent more than 2 years fighting a global war. Those years were not spent waiting. They were spent learning how to fight the Nazis, often the hard way. The lessons Britain paid for in blood would later benefit the entire Allied war effort, including the United States. One of the most overlooked British contributions was intelligence. Long before American forces landed in Europe, British codebreakers were already inside Hitler's communications. At Bletchley Park, British mathematicians and cryptographers cracked the German Enigma code. This allowed Britain to read enemy plans, track U-boat movements, and anticipate major attacks. These breakthroughs quietly saved thousands of Allied lives. When America joined the war, this intelligence system was already operational and battle-tested. Britain also pioneered modern strategic bombing. Early RAF bombing campaigns over occupied Europe were costly and controversial, but they forced Germany to divert aircraft, fuel, and anti-air defenses away from the Eastern Front and Atlantic. These missions weakened German industry long before the U.S. Army Air Forces began their large-scale daylight bombing raids. By the time American bombers filled the skies, Britain had already absorbed the worst losses and refined the strategy. In the Mediterranean, British victories reshaped the map. The Royal Navy secured key sea lanes, keeping Axis forces under pressure. British troops fought brutal campaigns in Greece, Crete, and the Middle East, often against overwhelming odds. While not all of these battles were victories, they delayed German expansion and drained resources Hitler desperately needed elsewhere. Delay mattered. Every month Britain held out made America's eventual entry more effective. Perhaps the most underestimated British achievement was simply survival. Britain kept fighting when defeat seemed certain. It maintained a functioning government, a working economy, and a fighting military under constant attack. This stability made Britain the natural staging ground for the eventual liberation of Europe. D-Day could not have happened without British ports, airfields, factories, and years of preparation under fire. Yet in popular memory, these contributions are often condensed into a short introduction before the real war begins. Hollywood timelines jump from Pearl Harbor straight to Normandy. The years Britain spent alone are blurred or skipped entirely. That narrative is not deliberate dishonesty, is convenience. Simple stories travel further than complex ones. America's arrival changed the scale of the war. Its manpower and industry were decisive. But scale is not the same as foundation. Britain built the foundation under relentless pressure. Without certainty of rescue, it trained pilots, refined tactics, and proved that Nazi Germany could be beaten. When American forces finally began fighting alongside British troops, the difference in experience was clear. British soldiers, pilots, and commanders had already spent years in combat against the German war machine. They had faced defeat, adapted, and learned. In many early joint operations, it was British experience that quietly shaped Allied strategy, even when American power dominated the headlines. The first major test came in North Africa in 1942. Operation Torch is often remembered as America's entry into the European ground war. But by then, British forces had already fought Rommel's Afrika Korps across deserts for years. They understood the terrain, the supply challenges, and German tactics. British victories at El Alamein had already broken Axis momentum. American troops arrived, brave but inexperienced, and early clashes, like the Battle of Kasserine Pass, exposed painful weaknesses. British commanders and advisors helped restructure Allied tactics, improving coordination, logistics, and leadership. In the air war, Britain again provided the backbone. The Royal Air Force had been fighting Germany since 1939. RAF pilots had learned how to survive against superior numbers, how to integrate radar, and how to manage large-scale operations. When American bomber crews began flying daylight missions, British intelligence and escort strategies helped reduce catastrophic losses. The air war became a combined effort, but it rested on British groundwork. The same pattern appeared at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic did not reset when America joined. British and Canadian navies had already spent years refining convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare. American ships initially suffered heavy losses to U-boats along the U.S. East Coast due to limited preparation. It was British experience, blackout rules, convoy discipline, and detection technology that helped close those gaps and secure vital supply lines. Even planning the invasion of Europe reflected this imbalance of experience. British commanders pushed for caution, preparation, and deception. Years of war had taught them the cost of rushing headlong into German defenses. Operations like the massive deception campaign before D-Day were deeply influenced by British intelligence culture. The goal was not just strength, but surprise. Yet when victory came, the story simplified again. American industry, manpower, and leadership became the dominant narrative, and rightly so, in many ways. But the invisible hand of British experience remained largely uncredited. Britain's early battles created a school of war that the entire Allied force would eventually attend. This does not suggest American forces were dependent or inferior. They learned fast. They adapted quickly. By 1944, the Allies operated as a unified machine. But unity does not erase origins. Britain entered the war first, fought longest in the West, and absorbed the earliest. As the war moved toward its climax, the balance of power clearly shifted. American factories outproduced the Axis. American troops arrived in enormous numbers. Yet even in this phase, many of the most critical victories rested on British-led planning. British held ground, and British experienced victories that later blended into a broader Allied story where national lines became blurred. The invasion of Normandy is often remembered as an American operation. In reality, it was a British-American-Canadian assault built on years of British preparation. Britain had spent 4 years turning itself into a fortress and a launchpad. Ports were expanded, airfields multiplied, and coastal defenses mapped in detail. British engineers tested landing craft designs, studied tides, and rehearsed amphibious landings long before D-Day became a date in history. On June 6, 1944, British and Canadian forces landed on the eastern beaches of Normandy. They faced heavily fortified positions and stiff resistance. At Sword, Gold, and Juno beaches, progress was slow and costly. British troops pushed inland, tied down elite German units, and protected the Allied flank. This prevented German counterattacks from splitting the invasion in two. Without that pressure, the landings could have collapsed in their earliest hours. In the weeks that followed, British forces fought brutal battles in the hedgerows and towns of Normandy. The fighting around Caen was especially intense. British units absorbed repeated German attacks, including armored divisions that might otherwise have been sent against American forces to the west. These battles were unspectacular and devastating, exactly the kind history tends to overlook. In the air, the RAF continued to play a decisive role. British night bombing forced German defenses into constant motion, while Allied air superiority shattered rail lines and supply routes. The systematic destruction of transportation networks was a British-driven strategy that limited Germany's ability to respond to the invasion. At sea, the Royal Navy protected the invasion fleet and maintained supply across the Channel. Mines were cleared, U-boats hunted, and artificial harbors were defended under constant threat. These operations rarely appear in popular retellings, yet without them, the Allied armies in France would have been stranded. As Paris was liberated and Allied forces pushed toward Germany, the narrative accelerated. The focus shifted toward speed, momentum, and final victory. In that rush, earlier British sacrifices blended into the background. Victory became a single wave, not a long tide. But war is not won in a moment. It is won through endurance. Britain's role in the final push was not flashy, but it was essential. The path to Berlin ran through years of British resistance, preparation, and sacrifice even when the spotlight moved elsewhere. As the war entered its final year, the imbalance in historical memory became even more pronounced. Victory was now visible on the horizon, and the story began to focus on who arrived strongest at the finish line, not who carried the weight. When the race was almost lost, Britain's role in the closing chapters of World War II remained critical, yet increasingly quiet. In Western Europe, British forces pushed steadily through Belgium and the Netherlands. These were not easy advances. German troops fought fiercely on familiar ground, using flooded fields, fortified towns, and civilian areas as shields. British and Canadian armies paid heavily to liberate cities like Antwerp, whose port would become essential for Allied supply. Without Antwerp functioning, the Allied advance toward Germany would have stalled from lack of fuel and ammunition. One of the costliest Allied operations of the war, Operation Market Garden, reflected Britain's willingness to take risks even late in the conflict. The plan aimed to end the war early by seizing key bridges in the Netherlands. British airborne troops at Arnhem fought, surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off. They held for days against overwhelming German forces. The operation failed, but the courage and sacrifice of those soldiers slowed German recovery and exposed remaining Axis strength. Failure, like victory, carried a price Britain was willing to pay. On the home front, Britain was exhausted. Cities were scarred, families broken, and resources stretched thin. Rationing continued even after the war ended. Unlike America, Britain emerged victorious, but financially drained. Its empire weakened, its global power permanently altered. This cost is often missing from victory narratives, yet it explains why Britain's voice faded in the post-war world. As Allied armies closed in on Germany, British forces liberated concentration camps and occupied key regions in the north. They faced the reality of what the war had been about from the beginning. Not just territory, but survival and morality. British troops helped stabilize shattered societies and manage millions of displaced civilians. These tasks did not make headlines, but they shaped the peace that followed. After the surrender, history began to settle into a simpler form. America emerged as a superpower. Its economy boomed. Its culture spread worldwide through film, television, and education. Britain, quieter and weakened, did not tell its story as loudly. Over time, silence was mistaken for absence. But silence does not mean insignificance. Britain's victories were not stolen, they were overshadowed. The war was a shared triumph, but shared does not mean equal in memory. Britain stood first, fought longest, and endured the moment when defeat seemed inevitable. To remember World War II honestly is not to divide credit, but to restore balance. Before America's strength filled the battlefield, Britain held the line, and in doing so, it ensured there would still. The way World War II is remembered did not happen by accident. It was shaped by what came next. As the Cold War began, the world looked to power, wealth, and influence. America had all three. Britain, though victorious, emerged weakened. This shift changed not just global politics, but global memory. In the decades after the war, American bases spread across Europe. American aid rebuilt shattered economies. American culture followed films, television, books, and later digital media. These stories naturally centered on American soldiers, American landings, and American triumphs. Britain's earlier role, defined by endurance rather than spectacle, did not translate as easily into mass storytelling. Even textbooks began to compress the timeline. World War II often starts with Pearl Harbor and accelerates rapidly toward D-Day. Britain's lonely years from 1939 to 1941 are summarized in a paragraph, not explored as the defining struggle they truly were. For younger generations, this creates the illusion that the war truly began only when America arrived. Canada's role followed a similar path. Canadian forces fought and died alongside Britain from the beginning in the Atlantic, in Italy, and on D-Day itself. Yet their contributions are also often folded into a larger narrative dominated by American imagery. The shared British-Canadian experience of early sacrifice became quietly overshadowed. This matters because memory shapes identity. Nations remember wars not only to honor the dead, but to explain who they are. Britain's war was a story of resistance without certainty, leadership under pressure, and survival without guarantees. These qualities are harder to dramatize than victory through overwhelming force, but they are no less important. There is also a moral lesson hidden in Britain's early battles. Standing alone did not guarantee success. Britain could have chosen compromise. It could have negotiated. Instead, it chose to fight, even when the odds were brutal. That decision changed the trajectory of the war and preserved the possibility of liberation for Europe. None of this erases America's role. The war could not have been won without American power. But power alone does not explain victory. Someone had to hold the line until that power arrived. Someone had to prove resistance was possible. History often crowns the finisher and forgets the one who ran the first miles alone. Britain ran those miles under fire. It lost cities, ships, and generations of young men, yet refused to collapse. That refusal is one of the most important victories of World War II, even if it never received a parade. To understand the war fully, we must widen the lens, not to divide allies, but to respect them. Britain did not seek glory. It sought survival, and in doing so, it kept hope alive long enough for the world to change. By the time the last guns fell silent, World War II had already begun transforming into legend. Legends simplify. They choose heroes, define moments, and leave the rest in shadow. For Britain, this meant that many of its hardest-fought battles became supporting chapters instead of central ones. Not because they lacked importance, but because they lacked spectacle. British victories were often defensive, slow, and costly, holding airspace, protecting shipping lanes, absorbing attacks, buying time. These are not the kinds of actions that end neatly in a single day or a single image. There is no clear finish line in endurance. Yet endurance was exactly what Britain provided when the outcome of the war was most uncertain. The Battle of Britain did not end with a surrender ceremony. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a dramatic breakthrough. Even El Alamein, a clear British victory, unfolded over weeks of grinding combat. These victories mattered not because they looked impressive, but because they prevented catastrophe. They stopped invasion, starvation, and collapse. History often struggles to celebrate battles that end in survival rather than conquest. For American audiences, the emotional center of the war naturally sits where their losses and triumphs were greatest. Normandy, the Ardennes, the push into Germany. These moments carry deep meaning, but meaning does not equal exclusivity. The war did not begin at Normandy, and it did not wait politely for America to be ready. Britain's war was fought with the knowledge that defeat would mean occupation. There was no ocean buffer, no untouched homeland. Every German bomber that crossed the Channel carried the threat of national destruction. That pressure shaped British decisions, leadership, and sacrifice in ways difficult to fully grasp decades later. Even after victory, Britain paid a long price. Food rationing continued into the 1950s. Cities rebuilt slowly. Global influence faded. Victory did not bring prosperity, it brought survival. America, by contrast, emerged stronger than ever. That difference shaped whose voice carried further into the future. This imbalance does not require correction through rivalry. It requires honesty through context. Britain's battles were not overshadowed because they were minor. They were overshadowed because they happened when the world was still unsure how the story would end. When we say America won World War II, we speak a truth, but not the whole truth. When we say Britain merely held on, we miss the point. Holding on, when collapse is expected, is itself a form of victory. History should not be a contest of flags. It should be a record of choices, costs, and consequences. Britain chose to fight early, alone, and at enormous risk. That choice created the conditions for everything that followed. Before glory came power, before power came endurance, and before endurance came Britain's battles fought not for recognition, but for survival. As decades passed, World War II slowly shifted from lived memory to inherited memory. Veterans aged, witnesses faded. What remained were stories passed down through media, museums, and national identity. In that transition, Britain's early and defining role became increasingly abstract, known, but not felt. For many American and Canadian audiences today, Britain's war exists as atmosphere rather than action. Churchill's speeches, the Blitz skyline, the stiff upper lip, powerful images, but often disconnected from the scale of what was actually achieved. Britain becomes the set, not the driver. Yet those images represent a nation making decisions that shaped the entire conflict. Britain's leadership during the war carried a unique burden. Every failure risked invasion. Every miscalculation risked starvation. Unlike later Allied operations, there was no margin for collapse. The British government had to fight, plan, negotiate alliances, and inspire a population under attack, all while lacking the overwhelming resources its future allies would enjoy. This pressure produced innovation, radar, intelligence sharing, special operations, deception warfare, and modern air defense all matured under British necessity. These were not luxuries of power, but tools of survival. When the United States entered the war, it did not start from zero. It joined an existing system, refined by years of British trial and error. Canada, too, was shaped by this early phase. Canadian sailors fought in the Atlantic from the beginning, suffering heavy losses long before America mobilized fully. Canadian troops trained and prepared in Britain, absorbing the same lessons of patience, logistics, and combined warfare. By D-Day, Canadian forces were among the most experienced Allied units in Europe, a fact often overlooked outside Canada itself. The modern tendency to frame World War II as a story of rescue misses the deeper truth. Britain was not waiting to be saved. It was actively shaping the battlefield, preserving a foothold in Europe, and ensuring that when America arrived, There was still a war left to win. Memory often favors outcomes over process. America's arrival marked acceleration and conclusion. Britain's role defined survival and direction. Both were essential, but only one easily fits a dramatic arc. Recognizing Britain's victories does not rewrite history. It restores depth to it. It reminds us that wars are not won only by those who finish strongest, but by those who endure longest under the worst conditions. As time continues to pass, the risk is not that Britain's role will be criticized, but that it will quietly vanish into symbolism, a speech, a photograph, a footnote. Yet behind those symbols were real victories, earned when the world was watching Britain to see if it would fall. It did not fall, and because it did not, history itself took a different path. In the end, World War II does not belong to one nation's memory alone. It belongs to all who fought it, suffered through it, and were changed by it. Yet how we remember the war still matters. Because memory shapes meaning, and meaning shapes how future generations understand courage, responsibility, and sacrifice. Britain's story in World War II is not one of stolen glory. It is one of quiet foundation. Britain did not wait for certainty. It fought when the odds were darkest. It absorbed the first blows, learned the first lessons, and paid the earliest price. Those actions did not guarantee victory, but without them, victory would not have been possible. America's story is different, but no less vital. When the United States entered the war, it brought unmatched industrial strength, manpower, and momentum. It accelerated the conflict and helped deliver its final outcome. That contribution deserves recognition and respect. But acceleration is not origin. Power is not preparation. The danger of simplified history is not prided as misunderstanding. If we believe wars are won only by strength at the end, we undervalue endurance at the beginning. If we remember only the final push, we forget the fragile moments when defeat was still the most likely outcome. Britain lived in those moments, when invasion seemed imminent, when supply lines were threatened, when allies were gone. Britain's victories were not always visible on maps, but they were decisive in shaping time for alliances to form, time for industries to mobilize, time for resistance to grow. This is why the phrase, "Britain won battles, America got the glory," resonates, not because it accuses, but because it reveals imbalance. Glory often follows power, not sacrifice. History's spotlight tends to settle where influence remains strongest. But true history is not about spotlight. It is about sequence. Britain stood first. It fought longest in the West. It held the line when there was no guarantee that anyone else would join. That alone makes its role irreplaceable. For American and Canadian audiences, understanding this does not weaken national pride. It strengthens it. It places victory in context as a shared achievement, built on different strengths at different times. Cooperation, not competition, won the war. As the last witnesses fade, the responsibility to remember correctly grows heavier. World War II was not a single nation's triumph. It was a chain of courage, and Britain forged the earliest links under fire. Before America's factories roared, Britain's cities burned. Before allied armies surged forward, Britain stood alone. And because it did, the world that followed was free to choose a different future. That is not forgotten history. It is unfinished history waiting to be remembered in full. When history looks back at World War II, it often asks who won. A better question is how victory was made possible. Wars are not decided in isolation. They are shaped by timing, resolve, and the willingness to fight before success is guaranteed. In that sense, Britain's role sits at the very center of the war's outcome, not as a footnote, but as a catalyst. Britain entered the conflict without the luxury of delay. It faced a modern, aggressive enemy with limited resources and shrinking allies. The decision to resist was not symbolic. It was practical, dangerous, and irreversible. Every early British victory in the air, at sea, and across distant fronts reduced Germany's options and increased the chances of eventual Allied success. These battles did not promise glory. They promised survival, and survival in 1940 and 1941 was the most valuable victory of all. Britain's ability to endure created a bridge between resistance and liberation. That bridge carried American industry, Canadian manpower, and Allied cooperation into Europe. What history often misses is that Britain fought without knowing the ending. Later victories benefit from hindsight. Early ones do not. British commanders did not know America would enter when it did. Civilians did not know their cities would be rebuilt. Pilots did not know if tomorrow's mission would be the one that broke them. Yet they fought anyway. This uncertainty gives Britain's battles their true weight. They were not fought from a position of strength, but from a position of necessity. That distinction matters. It reminds us that courage is not measured by confidence, but by action taken in fear. For American and Canadian audiences, this perspective adds depth, not discomfort. It shows that Allied victory was layered. Different nations carried different burdens at different times. America brought scale and final force. Canada brought steady commitment from the beginning. Britain brought resistance when resistance seemed futile. The danger of forgetting Britain's early victories is not historical error, it is moral loss. When we forget endurance, we undervalue resilience. When we forget early sacrifice, we misunderstand how freedom survives its darkest hours. World War II was not won by a single moment, landing, or leader. It was won by a sequence of decisions made under pressure. Britain made the first of those decisions to stand, to fight, and to refuse collapse. That decision echoed across oceans and years. It reached America, it reached Canada, it reached occupied Europe. It kept the idea of victory alive when victory itself felt impossible. Britain did not ask for glory, it asked for time, and in buying that time, it helped save the world. This is not a rewritten history, it is a completed one. In the final telling, World War II is best understood not as a race, but as a relay. Each nation carried the burden when it could, passed it on when it must, and depended on others to finish the task. Britain's role was to carry the opening leg, the most uncertain, the most dangerous, and the least rewarded. When Britain stood alone in 1940, there was no guarantee the relay would continue, no promise of American entry, no certainty that the Soviet Union would survive, no assurance that Europe could ever be liberated. The war could have ended early and badly. That it did not is Britain's most important victory. This reality challenges comfortable myths. It reminds us that freedom often survives because someone chooses resistance over safety. Britain's early battles were acts of refusal to surrender airspace, refusal to lose control of the seas, refusal to accept a future shaped by Nazi dominance. These refusals reshaped history long before liberation armies marched. For American and Canadian audiences, recognizing this does not take away from national sacrifice. It honors alliance. It explains why cooperation mattered and why trust already existed when joint operations began. Britain was not a passive partner waiting for rescue. It was an active belligerent that kept the war alive until rescue became possible. The phrase, "history gave America the glory," is not an accusation. It is an observation about how power influences memory. America emerged from the war stronger than it entered. Britain emerged victorious, but diminished. Over time, strength speaks louder than endurance. Stories follow influence, yet endurance is what makes influence meaningful. Britain's war effort proved that democracy could survive sustained assault. That lesson mattered during the war, and it matters still. It is easy to fight when victory feels close. It is harder and more important to fight when defeat feels inevitable. As we look back now, nearly a century later, the task is not to rearrange medals. It is to understand sequence. Britain's battles came first. They shaped the conditions under which America and its allies could succeed. Without that foundation, your glory would have had nothing to stand on. World War II should not be remembered as a single nation's triumph, but as a chain of resolve. Britain forged the earliest links in that chain under relentless pressure. Others strengthened them. Together, it held. History becomes clearer when we allow it to be complex. When we accept that victory can have many authors, many costs, and many forms. Britain's victories were real, decisive, and earned when the world was closest to darkness. They deserve not louder praise, but lasting recognition. And with that recognition, the story of World War II finally stands complete.